Okay, everybody, welcome to Module 2 of this class. I am your instructor, Pierce. Welcome back. Quick recap of last week. SNHU, without telling the faculty, actually emailed some students and said that the initial discussion board post for week 1 was due Sunday night. So I apologize for that miscommunication. Everybody will get full credit and not be counted late as long as it was in by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. EST. Other than that, I mostly want to talk about Module 2, the introduction of Module 2, and Chapter 3 of the textbook. Before getting into that, let me say a couple things. One, I hope to have my iPad set up with a virtual whiteboard next week, by the end of next week, or the beginning of next week, so I can actually be doing like live whiteboard writing for everybody while I make these video announcements. And so it can be kind of like a actual lecture and not just me talking, which, you know, hopefully talking works, but I'd like to be able to give you some visuals or something to take in notes. The other thing is, yes, I am wearing a Jordan Peterson shirt, if you know who that is. Controversial figure. I myself am not a fan of Jordan Peterson. I don't really like Jordan Peterson. I don't really agree with him on a lot of stuff. But my friend likes Jordan Peterson, and he got me this shirt, which is just ridiculous and insane. It looks like some sort of band photo, and I thought it was funny, but also I wouldn't be wearing it, but I have a newborn. It's 10 o'clock at night, and I have no other clean laundry right now because my newborn is taking up all my time. So, sorry. Just a disclaimer there, right? Okay. Jumping into Module 2 and especially Chapter 3. Let me do a screen share real quick. Here's the introduction to Module 2. Module 2 introduction. You will see, and I want to address this because I think this is actually really important for your understanding of ethics and what we're doing in this class and other philosophy classes in general. And this can be really misleading. It says in the learning objectives, describe how morals and values differ from ethics. In the module overview, how morals and values differ from ethics. Why we'll learn about it. Ethics are not identical to morals and values. Okay, let's talk about this because this is something that I find very problematic. In one sense, that's absolutely true, right? Typically, you know, it all depends on how you define these terms, morality, ethics. Let's just get this out of the way. Let's say your personal values, your personal beliefs, your personal moral code or principles are not the same necessarily as the truth about ethics, right? You might be wrong. Or there might be no truth about ethics, right? Alternatively, we could also say that your personal values are a sort of subjective belief, but what the right values are is what ethics is trying to discover. But then we can also separate that from ethics is the study of morality and moral values. Right? It's the study of those things, and it's not just a descriptive study. That would be moral psychology or sociology, purely descriptive. It's the evaluative or normative study. It's trying to figure out which ethical values are good and bad, which ethical codes and principles are right or wrong to hold, what should we believe and value and do, how should we live, right? That's what ethics is. It's the normative or evaluative study of morality and ethical principles and values, right? So, of course, in a trivial sense, morality and values is distinct from ethics, right? Ethics is a study of those things. It's kind of like saying that this mathematics is the study of mathematical truths. So technically, mathematical truths and math are two different things, right? Right? The study of the truths and the truths are two different things. But that's really trivial, right? Normally, when we talk about morality and ethics, what we're talking about is right and wrong, good and evil, the sort of normative judgments and normative beliefs and normative truths about what's good, what's bad, what's valuable, what's right, what's wrong, what we should do, what we shouldn't do. Normally, when we say the word morality, that's what we're talking about. Included in that is beliefs about what has value and what doesn't, or how you rank things of value. What do you put higher? Family or a Ferrari? That's a type of moral evaluative judgment. What do you value more? What do you think other people should value more? Ethics is a study of those sorts of things. So as you can see, the module overview and introduction saying that morals and values differ from ethics can be misleading, because ethics is a study of those things, right? We're not saying that ethics has nothing to do with morality and value. We're just saying that you could be saying, on the one hand, your personal opinions isn't the same thing as the truth necessarily. Maybe you're mistaken, or maybe there is no truth. That's what some people believe. Some philosophers believe there really is no truth. They're called nihilists. Or we could also be saying that the study of it is different from your personal values or what really has value, right? But it's kind of misleading. And in history, up until very recently, philosophers didn't really talk about ethics and morality as though they were distinct things. We didn't really talk about like ethics until the last couple hundred years. We talked about the notions of like the good or the beautiful. And everything was kind of lumped together. And, you know, classically, as we're going to learn about in virtue ethics, the most ancient and popular theories about ethics up until like the 1700s AD basically saw the truth, existence, goodness, moral goodness, which includes values and right and wrong, and beauty, like aesthetic beauty, all as one in reality fundamentally, right? They all convert, they're called the transcendentals. And so ethics wasn't seen as this distinct thing floating out there, this distinct study. It was seen as just reflection on the part of philosophy or the part of truth seeking that has to do with human behavior or the good. But it also has to do with the beautiful, right? I wrote a paper, if you ever want to see it. I gave it at a conference. I'm trying to get it published, about how in the Middle Ages especially, ethics and aesthetics, the theory of art and theory of morality were actually very tightly related. They weren't two completely distinct things. But so I just want to be really clear that this module, it's kind of misleading. The book isn't really misleading, but this module summary is, and I think I'll give them a little bit of input on how to change that. Typically, when modern philosophers talk about morality and ethics, they say something like, well, ethics is really just the study of like how humans should socially relate to each other. And it's like, okay, I guess you can define it that narrowly, but I'm just telling you right now, that is not how philosophers and people talked until very recently, right? So just please keep it in mind that when we talk about morality, when we talk about ethics, when we talk about values or anything evaluative and normative meaning you should believe it or it has authority over you in some way. It's right or wrong, good or evil. These things are loose terms. And in this class, we're talking about all of that, especially as it relates to international policy, international activity, and how we should relate as individuals and as groups to other people in different countries and to the earth and humanity as a whole. That's global ethics. And as we've been talking about, professional ethics is what's right or wrong, what sort of principles and values should certain types of professions or companies or institutions with people in it abide by. right? So I don't want you to see these things as just completely ethics is over here, morality is over here, values are over here. It's all messy and it all kind of interrelates. And until you develop your own opinions about these things, you should just have an open mind and just think of it in very general terms. Think about value, right and wrong, good and evil, your duties and your obligations, right? That type of stuff. Don't worry too much about classifying things. Keep it simple. Right? Okay. So there's that out of the way. Moving into chapter 3. Chapter 3 is actually a pretty good introduction to virtue ethics. And that's what I want to spend most of our time about, because I'm very passionate about virtue ethics. And it's very easily misunderstood because, again, as the book says, virtue ethics was really the dominant theory of ethics. And it's not really a theory. It's more of an ethical framework, or as this module calls it, an ethical perspective or point of view. I like to say a moral paradigm. It's a way of seeing the world. It's a general kind of structure of how you think about right and wrong, good and evil, that helps you understand the world as a whole. It helps you understand and work out the moral and ethical problems and the problems of value within that framework. It's kind of like glasses you see the world through. That's what a moral paradigm or perspective is. It's not necessarily specific theory about this is what's good, this is what's bad. It's a general overarching pattern or model of how goodness and a good life and being a good person work in general, right? So there's a lot of the details. You could get 10 different virtue ethicists and they work out the details in very different ways. The important part of virtue ethics that the book talks about and that I want to talk about is that kind of virtue ethics as an overall paradigm or framework for doing ethics, right? And the book does a pretty good job. What the book kind of glosses over and leaves out is that, yes, it was the dominant theory, and then in the 1700s, by the time of the mid-1700s, it was replaced by utilitarianism or Kantianism, which was called deontology in the last chapter. And it's really only in the 1960s that it starts to come back as a popular approach. And within my lifetime, like when I first started undergrad and getting my bachelor's degree, it was like really taking off like really, really strongly. And, you know, I'm a virtue ethicist. A bunch of people are still working on it. People my age tend to be virtue ethicists right now, especially if they're working in like philosophy of religion, stuff like that. So it's kind of getting popular again. But what has happened is that the context of virtue ethics has really changed. In the past, virtue ethics was very strongly linked to different kinds of religion. So for Aristotle, you know, living 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece, he has a Greek polytheistic religion, and his notion of what's good and evil, what's virtuous, as we'll cover in a minute, is very different from, several hundred years later, Christian virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is basically the Christian view of morality and ethics. And it's also the Jewish and Muslim view. It's very well ingrained into those religious traditions. It's the same framework Aristotle had, but the particular details differ, right? Aristotle had the Greek gods as models, so he thought a good person looked like one of the Greek heroes, right? Strong, resilient, courageous, but not stupid running into battle. Christian virtue ethics, on the other hand, takes Jesus as the example. And so what do you have? Yeah, you have strength, but you ultimately have self-sacrifice, love, again, under self-sacrifice, meekness, and a willingness to suffer for other people. That's very different from what Aristotle has, right? The framework is the same, as we'll talk about, but the content's different. And what happened after the Enlightenment is basically the death of religion. It's not really dead. No one thinks religion doesn't exist anymore or is actually dying. But a lot more people are not religious, and a lot of people are atheists or some sort of naturalist now, in that they don't believe in God, or they don't believe in the same kind of God anymore. And so the content of virtue ethics has once again changed. Aristotle had it one way. Christianity took over virtue ethics and changed it. Then a little bit later, Islam changed that a little bit. Over time, it continues to evolve. Then with the Enlightenment, massive cultural and intellectual shifts end up changing virtue ethics again. So that modern day virtue ethics doesn't necessarily look a whole lot like Christian or Aristotelian virtue ethics, right? There's essentially, if I could sum it up, they're trying to do virtue ethics without appealing to anything immaterial or supernatural, right? Plato and Socrates also had virtue ethics that was slightly different from Aristotle and then different from Christianity. It's all very messy, and you have to study this for a long time to understand. But what I'm trying to get across to you is that your background beliefs about metaphysics or about the structure of reality, whether God exists, what God is like, shape the content of your ethics significantly. And so even though virtue ethics is popular now, it could look very different from the virtue ethics you find 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, or even still find today in Catholic or other types of Christian philosophy and theology, right? There's natural virtue ethics, naturalistic and atheistic virtue ethics. And then there is, religious virtue ethics. Same overall framework, but very different details. Very different ways of grounding and making sense of morality and the specific virtues and values we have. So what we're talking about right now isn't any particular virtue ethical theory, especially in the book. What the book tries to do is to give you an overview of the general structure that we kind of all roughly agree on as virtue ethicists, and give you a feel for the overall structure. I want to expand on that a little bit. I want to explain to you what I would consider the more classical ways from Aristotle and Christian and Islamic and Abrahamic and Jewish theology and philosophy, the really dominant ways of doing virtue ethics in general, up to recently, because it's changed. And I'm also including links to different articles about this, including one I wrote, because if you're actually interested in this, if you want to understand this stuff, you have to read a little bit more, because things have changed so radically. The world, we're in a big state of change right now, culturally and intellectually. We're kind of like the children of a massive intellectual shift over the last few hundred years, and we're still working out where we go from here. So I think it's important for all of you to kind of understand that. And if you want to know more, let me know. But okay, virtue ethics in general. Here's what virtue ethics says. The key to living a good life, the key to thinking about ethics and morality, the fundamental thing is not the consequences of your actions. All that factors into things, right? We're not saying it's irrelevant. We're just saying that's not the only concern. That's not even the primary concern. Rather, the fundamental primary concern when you're trying to think about what's right or wrong or what you should do or shouldn't do, the primary concern is on your moral character, who you are as a person, and what you do, how that reflects and shapes who you are. I hope that makes sense. So, the classic example that someone like Aristotle would give, who again, father of virtue ethics, his book Nicomachean Ethics is like the foundational text of virtue ethics. The classic example is of a horse. What Aristotle says it is to be a good horse, well, it's strong, it's healthy, it can run fast, it can carry weight really well, it's muscular, right? It might be a clear example. I like the example of a hammer more. This is another classical example. You take a hammer. What makes something a good hammer? Well, the hammer has to be made in a certain way, right? It has to be made strong and resilient and tough, but it also has to be shaped to a human hand so we could hit nails with it, right? So it has to be strong enough to resist breaking, shouldn't be made out of glass. And it has to fit our hands and our bodies so that we can actually use it, right? Well, I want you to just reflect on the idea of what a hammer is and what it's used for. And think about what that involves. That involves two things. It involves a way that we have to be made or a way that we have to be built. Like what we are. Our properties, our attributes, what we are. Okay? So let's just say the type of thing we are or the hammer is. The other thing is that it involves our purpose, our meaning, what we're supposed to do, right? For the hammer, it's hitting nails, and maybe if you have, the claw hammer on the other end, it's pulling nails too. So hitting and pulling nails. So the two aspects of what makes a hammer a good hammer, or what makes anything good, are how it's made or its internal features, what it is, how it's put together. Okay, let's call that its character, and what it's supposed to do. Its actions. I like to call them its ideal activities, right? So who you are, who or what you are, and what you're made to do. Two parts of virtue ethics. A good hammer is a hammer that's built the right way. It's the right kind of thing. And it's also used and useful for doing those activities, right? A good person, again, the details change for different theorists and for different religions and eras. A good person is made the right way and develops themselves to have the right kind of features to accomplish the goals that people are meant for. So the idea of virtue ethics is that what's central isn't the consequences of our actions. That's part of it, but it's not the only factor. What's central to thinking about what we should do is the kind of person we are and our character and what we're meant to do. So that's the core of virtue ethics. It's a framework where you see ethics where the primary thing is thinking not just about what you do, but who you are, the type of person you are, how you develop your character. I would go so far, although this might be a little controversial. Again, when I say that it's a general framework, I'm talking about when I say it's the primary concern of virtue ethics to be the right type of person or the right type of thing and do what we're meant to do. I'm not saying that it's some formula. If we meet those criteria, that's what a good life is or whatever, right? I'm saying it's the primary concern. It's what we're focused on. I'm not going to give you a really precise formula about it or something. Okay? It's very contextualist, as in it takes personal situations into account. It takes how we're all individuals into account, and maybe we're meant to do specific things. Maybe I'm not meant for the same thing you are, right? Or maybe we're all meant for the same thing. Different theorists have different opinions. But again, when you're thinking about how to live a good life, and when you're thinking about what I should do, how I should live, what is right and wrong, you primarily think in terms of, will this make my character better? Will this make me become or develop into the type of thing I'm meant to be so that I can effectively carry out the activities I'm meant to do? Let's say you're building a hammer. You want to develop the hammer in a way that it's strong and resilient. It's shaped a certain way so we can hold it and get leverage and also pull nails so that it can do what it's meant for. That's the analogy, right? Virtues, hence the name virtue ethics, are properties or character traits we have that help us carry out our function, our purpose, right? So for instance, if I want to, because this is a tradition I'm in, and this is a tradition I work in my publications and my professional writing. Let's say we're working within some sort of like vaguely Christian virtue ethics, right? The primary virtue for the Christian is love. Love of God and love of your fellow man and love of God's creation, right? That's the primary virtue. If I want to be a good person, if I want to do what I'm meant to do, which is to love God and love other people, I have to become the type of person who can do that, not just accidentally do that. Like, oh, one day I wake up and I just love everyone, and then the next day I go to sleep and I'm back to being selfish, right? I want to be the type of person who it's in my character to automatically and reliably love God and love other people. That's what a virtue is. You're virtuous, you have the virtue of love when you reliably are disposed. You're the type of person that is deeply ingrained in you. When you see somebody else, you almost automatically love them, right? When you think about God, you love God. That's what like a Christian virtue of love would be. Let's talk about the virtue of charity, right? Aristotle might call this a virtue of liberality or liberal giving. Having the virtue of charity is to have the character trait that if somebody comes up to me in need of something and I can give it, I freely give it. I decide to give it to them reliably and not just on a whim, but because it's acting out of who I am. I'm disposed to do that. So, two situations. Poor person comes up to me and asks, can I have food? I have an extra hamburger with me that I'm not going to eat. I'm just going to throw it away. Someone who has the virtue of charity will be disposed to go, oh yeah, of course, here you go. Right? And in their minds, if they're really charitable, if they have that virtue to a high degree, they're not going to hesitate. They're not going to have to battle with themselves, right? They're going to give it freely, almost automatically. Somebody who's very stingy and not charitable, poor person's going to come up and they'll go, I don't know, let me think about it. You got to think. Okay, here you go. Both act the same way. Both act charitably. But the things that are different is the heart. I'm not just talking about the reasons they do it, the motives. They might have the same reasons. Perhaps they know that God commands them to be charitable. They have the same reasons. But what differs is that one person has crafted or been born with a disposition to charity, and the other person is born with a disposition to be more stingy. One person has the virtue of charity. One person has the vice of stinginess, right? So virtues are character traits that dispose you to doing the right thing. Not just the right or good thing, but the thing we're meant to do, right? Aristotle says man is a rational animal. Okay, so we're an animal, so we're meant to live in a body and have all these biological functions and do all the things animals do, eat, procreate, have socialization with other species, live on this earth, but also we're rational. We have an intellectual side. So for Aristotle, we have to develop ideally, although he recognized we can't all do this due to disabilities and luck, but ideally we develop our bodies, we develop bodily virtues, and we also develop intellectual or spiritual virtues, right? We're good at thinking. We're good at the intellectual side of things. So in sum, what virtue ethics, kind of the overall framework of virtue ethics is that when you're talking about morality, you don't just want to approach things by looking at the consequences, like utilitarianism. You're calculating the outcomes of everything you do. That might be part of it if you have the virtue of wisdom and intellectual virtues, right? But your primary concern isn't just the consequences, it's becoming the right sort of person and doing what you're meant to do. That's the overall framework. Now, if you believe in God, if you're religious, you probably believe that ultimately you can ask the question, okay, but who says what virtues are good or bad? What are virtues and what are vices? Who decides? Aristotle thinks, frankly, Aristotle thinks women are incapable of virtue to the level men are. And Aristotle also thinks that it's a virtue to be like a heroic warrior who goes and kills a bunch of people and is really brave. Christian virtue ethics wouldn't agree with that. Again, using Jesus Christ as the example, you would say something like meekness, love, self-sacrifice, patience, kindness, charity, right? It'll look a little different. Who's to say that Aristotle got the virtues wrong and Jesus got them right? Well, if you appeal to God, you ultimately can say, well, God says it, so it's right. And there's different ways of making sense of that. You can say God says it, so it's right, and it's just completely arbitrary. That's called voluntarism, where it's like whatever God says goes, and God doesn't have any reason for saying anything's right or wrong. It's just random, but you just have to do it anyway. That's voluntarism. The other sort of view is that, well, God necessarily is himself good and beautiful, and he's telling you how to be like himself. And we all agree that if God is perfectly good and perfectly beautiful, we all want to be like him. So that's what makes it right. Right? If you don't believe in God or you're not religious, you look for other ways to explain or ground what counts as virtue, what counts as vice. In other words, what our purpose is, what the things we're supposed to do are, and the types of character traits we're supposed to have. There's a lot of different views about this. Some people go back to Aristotle and they look at, okay, man is a rational or intellectual animal. And they try to unpack what it is to be both a good animal and a good intellectual or rational being. Okay. The ethics of care, or feminist ethics, a lot of philosophers basically think that's a type of virtue ethics. But instead of the image of a virtuous person being a man, like for Aristotle, like a Greek warrior, a warrior philosopher king is how Aristotle would think of a virtuous person. A role model, if you will. The feminist ethicist, the feminist virtue ethicist, will put perhaps the image of a mother. An ideal mother is your moral exemplar or your role model. And that basically sets the standard for what you think about it. And that's why, as the book describes, the ethics of care makes the primary virtue care. It's very similar in a lot of ways. People think feminism is incompatible with Christianity. This is just a tangent. They think it's like in distinction to that. But the ethics of care and the ethics of love, very similar, right? Like I was talking about, for Christians and for most Abrahamic faiths, the primary virtue is love. That's almost just a different way of saying that the love of a mother is, you could also describe it as care. So there's certain ways of making them compatible, right? The book doesn't really go into that. I just thought it's important to mention. But a feminist ethicist working in the ethics of care might say, yeah, the primary virtue is care, as in a mother's care, and we should model ourselves after that and learn how to be caring for everything and everyone around us, especially those that we're intimately acquainted with, right? So different details, but what everybody pretty much agrees on is that it's not just a matter of looking out, seeing some abstract deontological principles, like in the last chapter when we covered deontology. Neither is it just a matter of calculating the consequences, as with utilitarianism or more broadly consequentialism. Rather, when we do ethics, the overall approach is to think about what makes us the type of person we're meant to be internally, not just in our heart, but our whole being, body, mind, and spirit, however you want to cut that up. And what are we meant to do? And how do we effectively do that? Right? That's the primary concern. Being the right type of thing, doing what we're meant to do. And all of that's wrapped up in the idea of becoming virtuous. Morally educating ourselves, building our character. You could also call it our final cause or teleology, what we're meant for, our telos, our final end, our proper end, our final cause, what we're meant for. Those are all equivalent terms. So I hope that explains virtue ethics. It's something that I feel I have a responsibility to tell you because a lot of surveys of it are kind of misleading and sound more complicated than it is. But there's the general framework. I hope that helps. Okay, if you have any questions or want more information, just let me know, and I'll give it to you. Bye, everybody.